All right, welcome, folks. My name is Jez. I am the Adult and Teen Programming Coordinator here at the library. So thank you for coming out tonight. This is a hybrid program, which means some of you are here in person and some of you are watching with us online. As you can see, our presenters are online, zooming in from the East Coast. So we're very lucky that we have some virtual programs that we can do this and still get to see our authors. I just want to go over a couple of things before we get started. So as I mentioned, this is hybrid. We took questions in advance this time to give to our moderator. So the Q&A has been turned off on Zoom for our online audience, but if you have any issues with technology, please let us know in the chat. We will be monitoring that throughout the performance. If you are here in person, please keep your masks on throughout the presentation, but we do have snacks here tonight, thanks to the Friends of the Library. So you obviously can take off your mask while you're eating, but then please put your mask back on. If you need to leave the room for any reason, please make sure the door closes quietly behind you. I'll be closing that in a few minutes here. We do have online, we turned on the live transcript option. If you do not want to see the closed captioning on your screen, just click the button that says CC. If you don't see that button, click where it says more or the three dots and then click hide subtitles. If you are here in person, we do have our assistive listening system set up. So if you would like to try one, we have these devices in the back. I'll have them at the table. It's just a little headphone that you put on and it'll bring the noise closer to your ear. It's the same thing coming through the speakers. So we do have those available at all of our programs. I think that is all I have right now. Yes. So I am going to turn it over to the Friends of the Library. Real quick, if you want to come and talk. They are sponsoring our event tonight. We are also partnered with Cool Cities. And if you are interested in some information about them, we have that up here at the end. You can check out the table here. And we will hear from our friends.
Good evening. I'm Kathy Perfita, and I'm the president of Friends of the Library. As we celebrate our 80th year, we wish to just say thank you to the library and all the programs that they provide for us. And we hope that getting our face out there a little bit more will have you energized to join our membership so that we have the ability to continue the funds to the library for the enrichment opportunities for the people of Elmhurst. All of the funds that we give are outside the ordinary budgetary means of the library, and they come through membership donations, fundraising, and individual donations to us. Membership information can be found on the library's website. Thank you and enjoy tonight's program.
Can you hear me? Yes. Okay. I just messed up. Well, welcome everyone. I cannot tell you how good it is to see all of you here in the library. It's wonderful that we still offer the option to come virtually because it's been kind of a surprise for us that a lot of people still do like to attend virtually, but we're really happy to support both. So welcome to the library tonight and welcome to our Friends of the Library group. As Kathy said, 80 years here in the library, helping us raise funds toward programming in the library. So thank you so much to all the friends. We really appreciate everything you do. And Cool Cities, I know you're here tonight too. I know we work with you on various projects. I think I heard that you recommended this book for this program. I loved the book. Can't tell you how much I enjoyed it. So I thank you for your recommendation. And my job here tonight is to introduce Doug Tallamy. So Doug is a professor in the Department of Entomology and Wildlife Ecology at the University of Delaware, where he has authored 80 research articles and has taught insect taxonomy, behavioral ecology, humans and nature, and other courses for over 40 years. Chief among his research goals is to better understand the many ways insects interact with plants and how such interactions determine the diversity of animal communities. Ptolemy was awarded the Garden Club of America Margaret Douglas Medal for Conservation and the Tom Dodd Jr. Award of Excellence in 2013. His 2007 book, Bringing Nature Home: How Native Plants Sustain Wildlife in Our Gardens, was awarded the 2008 Silver Medal by the Garden Writers Association. His most recent book, Nature's Best Hope: A New Approach to Conservation That Starts in Your Yard, is a New York Times bestseller and this year's EPL One Book, One Community pick. Please join me in welcoming Doug Tallamy.
Well, thank you very much. It is a pleasure to be here tonight, so I can talk to you about my idea of what nature's best hope is. But before I do that, I want to talk about another author, Edwardo Wilson, one of the most impactful biologists of all time, certainly of our time. He's retired from Harvard at this point, but he still writes a book a year, even though he's 92. The book he wrote in 2016 is called Half Earth: Our Planet's Fight for Life. And this reflects his lifelong quest to try to save biodiversity on planet Earth. And his message in this book was that if we're going to save life on Earth anywhere, we have to dedicate at least half of the Earth to nature to support that life. And he spends most of the book talking about the science that supports that statement. So saving half the Earth for nature, that sounds good, particularly to conservationists. But, you know, half of the Earth is already in some form of agriculture, and we've got almost 8 billion people in the other half, along with all of our detritus and all of our roads and airports and everything else. And we don't have a third half to put aside for nature. So a lot of people are scratching their heads and wondering just how this could be possible. Well, I do think we can realize EO's dream, but we're going to need a new approach to conservation to do that. And that is what I want to talk about tonight. But first, let's talk about what happened, particularly in the East. I'm not sure if it happened in the Midwest. In 2019, we had what we call an oak mast, where members of the red oak group got together and decided to make their acorns at the same time. And this is what it looked like in a lot of places. Well, I'm easily entertained, so I took one of those acorns and I just stared at it. And I was rewarded because an insect started to chew its way out of the acorn. First, it chewed a hole for its head, and it forced its head through there. Then it forced its entire body through that little hole. It was a tight squeeze, looked like the Pillsbury Doughboy. Finally, it plopped down, and that's a very dangerous time for this insect larva because it's good to eat. A lot of things are after it. So it gets to safety by wiggling and squirming beneath the soil surface in about 30 seconds. And once it's underground, it stretches in all directions and forms a chamber. And within that chamber converts itself to a pupa. And then it stays there for 2 years. And after 2 years comes out as an adult, an acorn weevil. That's what an acorn weevil looks like. A lot of people think weevils have big noses because it looks like they do. But that's actually an extension of the head capsule. And the mouth parts are way down here at the end of that extension. And they take those mouth parts and chew a hole into the center of the acorn, turn around and lay an egg in that hole. And that is how the larva gets down there. We might wonder why they spend 2 years underground. Why don't they come out the very next year? And the answer is it takes red oak acorns 18 months to complete their development. So if they came out the very next year, there wouldn't be enough acorns for them. Once they leave the acorn, of course, that leaves a hole, a true vacuum. And you know that nature abhors a vacuum. And in this case, she has filled it with 3 species of temnothorax ants, tiny little ants where the entire colony lives in the holes made by acorn weevils in acorns. And if scouts find a new hole, they get very excited because their old acorn is falling apart. So they got to find a new home. They tell everybody it is time to move. They grab the larvae, they grab the eggs, they move the entire colony into the new acorn in about 30 minutes. Then they post a guard here, make sure nobody else comes in. And that's where they're going to live for the next 2 years until this acorn falls apart. What's my point with this little story? My point is very simple. That is just one of literally millions of very specialized interactions between animals and plants that comprise the bulk of nature. This is another one, the relationship between jays and acorns. Jays are the primary disperser of acorns, of oak acorns. They'll grab an acorn and fly up to a mile from the parent tree. Then they tap it below the surface of the soil. The object is they're going to go get it in the wintertime and have something to eat. But for every 4 acorns they bury, they only remember where one is. So for every 4 acorns they bury, they're actually planting 3 oak trees. Relationship between pileated woodpeckers and carpenter ants. That's what they feed their young, carpenter ants. So you won't have pileated woodpeckers unless you have a lot of carpenter ants, and you won't have a lot of carpenter ants unless you have the big trees that make those carpenter ants. You won't have this bee, Andrena facilii, unless you have Phacelia. That is the only pollen that bee can rear its young on. And it turns out that pollen specialization is very common in our native bees. We have over 4,000 species of native bees, and almost a third of them can only rear their young on pollen of particular plants. You won't have Baltimore checker spots unless you have white turtlehead. I could talk all night, all week, all year about nature's specialized relationships. My point is, though, that these relationships, nature itself, is on the ropes today. And it's on the ropes because we did not take Teddy Roosevelt's advice. Way back in 1908, Teddy heard that the state of Arizona was going to mine the Grand Canyon. So he went to the canyon, stood on the edge, and looked out over its wonderful view. And he said, "Leave it as it is." And with those 5 words, he started the process of creating the Grand Canyon National Park. Well, we didn't do that. We didn't leave it as it was. There's only about 5% of the lower 48 states that's anything close to its original pristine ecological condition. And that's because we have logged the country repeatedly. We have tilled it. We have drained it. We have grazed it. We've got 770 million acres of rangeland. That's 4.5 times the size of Texas dedicated to cattle. And of course, we paved it or otherwise developed it. We have straightened our rivers and dammed them, and you can spell that any way you want. We have polluted our skies and changed our climate for centuries to come. We've drained our aquifers. We've introduced more than 3,300 species of plants from other continents, many of which are running amok in our natural areas. In short, we've carved up those natural areas into tiny remnants of their former selves. And each one of those remnants is too small and too isolated from other remnants to sustain the amount of nature, the species that run the ecosystems that we all depend on. Why have we done this? I don't know. But I suspect we thought that the Earth, our nest, was so big we could foul it forever and there wouldn't be any consequences. But of course, we were wrong about that. And that's why we're seeing some pretty scary headlines these days, like the insect apocalypse is here. What does it mean for the rest of life on Earth? Talking about global insect decline. Followed by this one, North America has lost 3 billion birds, 3 billion breeding birds in the last 50 years. That's almost a third of our North American bird population already gone. The UN now says that there's 1 million species that very possibly will go extinct in the next 20 years. And I love the way they say this, as if it's an option, and just go on to the next headline. They might as well say that we're going to lose oxygen in the next 20 years, then go on to the next headline as if it doesn't matter. You know, 3 weeks ago, I think it was, they removed 23 species from the endangered species list, not because we've saved them, but because they're already extinct. So this is happening, but we can't allow it to continue. So I could go on talking about the pox that we humans have delivered upon the environment, and thus upon all of our houses. But that's not what this talk is about. This talk is about a cure for that pox. It's a cure that'll take small efforts from lots of people like you, but those efforts are going to deliver enormous physical, psychological, and environmental benefits to everybody. Let's return briefly to this headline. The insect apocalypse is here. What does it mean for the rest of life on Earth? Well, back to E.O. Wilson. He told us what it would mean if Earth lost insects. And he did it way back in 1987 with this paper, The Little Things That Run the World. And again, his message was very clear. Life as we know it depends on insects. And if they were to disappear, so would most of our flowering plants. And if most of our flowering plants disappeared, that would so drastically change energy flow through our terrestrial ecosystems that the food webs that support our animals, our amphibians, our reptiles, our birds, our mammals, even our freshwater fish, those food webs would collapse and those animals would disappear. The biosphere, the living portion of the Earth, would rot because we would have lost insect decomposers that rapidly turn over nutrients. And of course, humans would not survive any of those drastic changes. The good news is that that doesn't have to happen. We can save our insects, we can save our birds, we can save nature itself, but we're going to have to change the way we landscape to do it. And we're going to have to change the way we landscape soon. Well, why is that? Remember, humans are products of nature. We are totally dependent on the life support systems that healthy ecosystems produce. We call them ecosystem services. Here are some of the things that plants do. They produce oxygen, obviously very important. They clean our water. They slow its journey to the sea where it's too salty to use. They're capturing carbon today, pulling carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere, taking the carbon out of that molecule and building their tissues out of it, and then pumping the extra carbon into the ground through their roots. Our soils are brown or black because of the carbon that plant roots have deposited there over the eons. And it's a very valuable ecosystem service today, of course. Plants are building topsoil, they're holding it in place, they're preventing floods, they're dampening severe weather, they're converting sunlight into food. If we lose plants, we're going to have to eat sunlight, and that will be difficult. What do animals do for plants? They provide pest control services. They pollinate nearly 90% of our flowering plants. They disperse plant seeds. So designing landscapes like this that destroy the production of ecosystem services is just not a good idea. Never was a good idea, but today it's a downright terrible idea because we need more ecosystem services today than ever before. Because we've got more people today. We've got, again, almost 8 billion people on planet Earth. Now, there have been visionaries who have recognized that we humans needed to work on our relationship with planet Earth. And Aldo Leopold was one of the most eloquent. He wrote extensively in the first half of the 1900s. One of the things he said is that the oldest task in human history is to live in a piece of land without spoiling it. Now, there have been indigenous groups who've been able to do that for long periods, but our huge Western societies and our huge Asian societies are terrible at doing that. We habitually take more from the earth than it has to offer, completely wrecking an area, going to another area, doing the same thing. Obviously not sustainable behavior. But Aldo Leopold had a lot of faith in humans. He believed we could develop what he called a land ethic. He knew we had to use the earth. We had to farm and lumber and graze and mine and do all of those things. But he truly believed that we could learn to do them gently enough that we did not destroy the ecosystems that support us. And that's what he called the land ethic. He wrote about it in the Sand County Almanac. What he did not talk about, though, was developing a land ethic where we actually lived. And I'm not sure why that was, but I suspect the notion that humans and nature cannot coexist in the same place at the same time was so deeply embedded in the culture of Aldo Leopold's day. It's still embedded in our own culture that he may not have recognized it as an option. But what I want to argue tonight is that living with nature not only is an option, is now the only viable option that is left to us. In the past, of course, conservationists worked pretty much exclusively where there weren't a lot of people. We now need to turn that on its head. We need to save nature, actually reconstruct it where we've destroyed it, where there are a lot of people, because that's pretty much everywhere. In other words, we need to find ways for nature to thrive in human-dominated landscapes, not hang on by a thread, but thrive. Where should we start? Well, let's go back to private property. If we don't do conservation on private property, we're going to fail because most of the land is privately owned. 85.6% of the US east of the Mississippi is privately owned. 98% of Texas is privately owned. 78% of the entire country is privately owned. If we only focus on parks and preserves, again, it's not going to work. It's obviously not working now, or we wouldn't be having all these issues because we already have those parks and preserves. So we now need to do conservation outside of parks and preserves, and that means on private property. So what I'm talking about really is rebuilding nature where we've torn it asunder. And we can do that by reuniting those specialized interactions that I opened the talk with. But not all species contribute to ecosystems equally. So we have to start with the most important ones, the building blocks, and then add the others later on. And there's two groups that we can't do without. The first would be the flowering plants and those pollinators that allow those flowering plants to reproduce. Those plants are capturing energy from the sun, turning it into food, and then storing it in their parts, mostly their leaves. So now we have the energy from the sun as food and plant leaves. We have to get it to animals, but most vertebrates don't eat plants directly. They eat invertebrates that eat plants. Most of those are insects. And it turns out that caterpillars are essential to sustaining food webs because caterpillars are transferring more energy from plants to other animals than any other type of plant eater. So if we design landscapes that don't have a lot of caterpillars in them, that's a failed food web. That's a failed ecosystem. Let's use the Carolina chickadee as an example. That's a chickadee we have down here in Southeast Pennsylvania. You've got the black-capped chickadee, practically the same bird doing the same thing. This is the bird that's at our feeder all winter long eating seeds, so we tend to think that's what chickadees need. 50% of their diet in the wintertime is seeds, but the other 50% is insects and spiders. And when they're reproducing, their babies can't eat seeds at all. So they switch entirely to insects. And if they're in a healthy environment, they will rear their young exclusively on caterpillars. And they are not exceptions. 96% of our terrestrial birds rear their young on insects, and most of those insects are caterpillars. How do I know that? Well, there's a number of lines of evidence that suggest that, but this is a citizen science project that one of my students did recently, Ashley Kennedy. She put out a call to bird photographers across the country to take pictures of birds during the breeding season when they're carrying food to the nest. They're supposed to send those pictures to Ashley. She was going to identify the prey items that are in the beaks of the birds and reconstruct the nestling diets of as many species of birds in North America as she could. And she got thousands of pictures, so it was very successful. This is a summary of her results. You're looking at the average nestling diet of 20 of the common bird families in North America. The green bars are the percentage of those nestling diets that were caterpillars, and in 16 out of the 20 common bird families, caterpillars dominated the diet. So imagine what would happen if we designed landscapes that didn't have enough caterpillars. Most of our birds would not be able to reproduce successfully. So what's special about caterpillars? There's actually a lot of things special about caterpillars, and one of them is that they're soft. So think of this guy as if he's a little sausage with a very thin wrapper. The thin wrapper is its exoskeleton, its cuticle. It's made of chitin. It's not digestible. And so the birds don't want a lot of chitin. And because they're soft, you can stuff it down the throat of your offspring without fear of injuring it. If you've ever watched a parent bird rear their young, they're pretty rough. Their beak is like a plunger. They just take it and stuff it down there. Caterpillars are also relatively large prey items. One medium-sized caterpillar is equal to the biomass of 200 aphids. Now, many of our birds do chase aphids around, but do you want to chase 200 aphids or get one caterpillar? They're nutritious. They're very high in fat, very high in protein. They have a low percentage of chitin of exoskeleton compared to many other types of insects, particularly beetles. Beetles are not like little sausages. They're like little tanks. So much of a beetle is undigestible, and a lot of beetles have very sharp edges too. And finally, caterpillars are the best source of carotenoids for birds during the breeding season. I mentioned carotenoids, not because I love organic chemistry, but because I'm a vertebrate and you're a vertebrate and birds are vertebrates. And we vertebrates cannot make our own carotenoids. Only plants make carotenoids. So we have to get our carotenoids from plants. And we have to get them from plants because carotenoids are essential components of our diets. Where are the birds getting their carotenoids from? From what they eat, of course, but carotenoid content in bird prey items is not at all equal. These first two bars here are types of caterpillars. They have far more carotenoids than other types of bird prey. Here are the adult caterpillars down here, the moths and butterflies themselves. They have far fewer carotenoids because they're not eating green leaves. That's where the carotenoids are. And here's the earthworm way down here. So the earthworm gets the worm, but he doesn't get any carotenoids when he gets the worm. So that study and several others suggest that caterpillars are not optional parts of bird diets. They're essential parts of bird diets. So let's just say birds need caterpillars. The next question is, how many do they need? Is one or two enough? One or two a day enough? Well, let's go back to Carolina chickadee, because there's a lot of data on Carolina chickadee. How many caterpillars does it take to make a nest of chickadees? One or two is not enough. One or two a day is not enough. It takes thousands. 6,000 to 9,000 caterpillars to get one clutch of chickadees through to the point where they leave the nest, depending on the number of chicks in the nest. And after they leave the nest, the parents continue to feed them caterpillars for another 21 days. So you're talking about tens of thousands of caterpillars to get one nest of a bird that's a third of an ounce, 4 pennies worth of bird through to independence. And if you want chickadees to breed in your yard, you have to have all those caterpillars in your yard, because the chickadees only forage 50 meters from the nest. They're not flying 5 miles down the road to the nearest woodlot. And if you don't have all of those caterpillars in your yard, that's called insect decline. And it's really looking like insect decline is directly related to the bird declines that we're measuring. We went to the original data set of Rosenberg et al. That's the Smithsonian group that said we've lost 3 billion birds, and divided the birds into two groups: the species that require insects, typically at breeding time, and the species that do not require insects. So things like doves and finches can actually reproduce on seeds because they turn it into a milk-like substance, and they feed that to their young. Well, the birds that did not require insects didn't lose any numbers in the last 50 years, but the birds that require insects lost on average 10 million individuals per species. That does not prove cause and effect, but it certainly is suggestive that as you take bird food away, you lose the birds. So we need to add a goal to how we landscape. In the past, we've landscaped exclusively for aesthetics. We want pretty landscapes, and we can keep doing that. But we also need ecologically functional landscapes, or all of these things that are disappearing are going to continue to disappear, and that will not be good. So how do we add caterpillars to our landscapes? We add caterpillars to landscapes by adding the plants that support those caterpillars. That seems pretty easy, but there is a catch. And that is that most plants don't support a lot of caterpillars. So we have to be fussy about which plants we pick. And we have to be fussy about which plants we pick because the caterpillars themselves are fussy. They'll only eat particular plants. And the monarch illustrates it perfectly. You can have all the crepe myrtle and all of the Bradford pear, Callery pear, all the hostas, all the burning bush, all the camellias, all the things we typically landscape with in your yard, and you won't make a single monarch butterfly. The only thing that's going to make a monarch butterfly is milkweed. That's called host plant specialization. And it turns out that most of the insects that eat plants are host plant specialists. Why? Because plants have made them that way. Plants don't want to be eaten. They want to capture the energy from the sun and use it for their own growth and reproduction. So they've loaded their leaves with nasty tasting chemicals, secondary metabolic compounds that make those leaves either bitter or downright toxic. And it's a really effective defense that keeps most of the insects of the world from eating most of the plants of the world. And that's why it's green out there in the summertime. It's not because there's no insects out there that want to eat those plants. It's because the insects that are out there can't eat most of the plants. They are too well protected. But we do know that insects eat plants. So how do they do that? How do they get around those chemical defenses? Well, this is where the specialization comes in. 90% of the insects that eat plants can only eat particular plants. They are specialized on just a few plant lineages. Every plant lineage that's out there protects itself with a unique cocktail of chemical defenses. And an insect species cannot adapt to all of them. So they pick one or two that are very similar in how they defend themselves. And they develop the specialized adaptations that allow them to get around those particular defenses. The enzymes that allow them to store and excrete and detoxify the compounds in those plants, the behavioral adaptations and life history adaptations that allow that insect to minimize its exposure to those compounds. It takes a long period of evolutionary history with those particular plant lineages for all those adaptations to fall into place. And once they do, the insect is locked into eating that particular plant. Can eat it really successfully, but it's lost the ability to eat anything else. So when you take the hosta or when you take the milkweed out of your yard and replace it with crepe myrtles or something else, the monarch doesn't start to eat crepe myrtles. It can't. It's locked into eating milkweeds. So the only option at that point is for monarchs to disappear from your yard. And that's why when we landscape with plants from other continents, we're destroying local food webs because our insects can't eat those plants. And when those plants escape into our natural areas and become invasive species, then we're wrecking the food web in our natural areas as well. So all I'm saying here is that plant choice matters. If we're trying to rebuild the food webs that support the ecosystems that support us, we need to choose the right plants. And I'm going to give you 3 examples of how well it works when we do choose the right plants, starting with our house. This is where my wife Cindy and I moved in Oxford, Pennsylvania, on a farm that was broken up. Last thing they did on this farm was to mow it for hay. It's a very old farm, been farmed for almost 300 years. So there was really very, very few plants there. And our goal was to restore the biodiversity on this property. Well, the only way you can do that is to rebuild those food webs that are based largely on caterpillars. So here's how we went about it. I wanted to see if I could get the Canadian owlet to join our little ecosystem here. That's what a Canadian owlet looks like. I've never even seen a Canadian owlet. That's what the adult looks like, just like a leaf. Well, Canadian owlets are host plant specialists on meadow row. You won't have them without meadow row. And we didn't have any meadow row. I'm sure there was meadow row here hundreds of years ago before it was all farmed to death, but it was long gone. So I got some meadow row seeds from someplace, planted them, and they grew very nicely. But this was early on, and I actually had very little faith that the Canadian owlets would be able to find my meadow row, or that it would take a long time for them to do it. So I didn't even go out and check my meadow row for about 2 months. And then I walked by for another reason. And there were Canadian owlets all over it. So they had found it right away. It was a big success. And I'm still surprised at how fast they found it. But now we've got a good population of meadow rue and Canadian owlet. So we've added 2 species to the property. Same story with the goldenrod stowaway. That beautiful moth actually is a misnomer, has nothing to do with goldenrod. It's a specialist on this plant, Biden's aristosa. Ditch daisy. I did know where there was some ditch daisy in a power line cut about 14 miles away. So I got some seeds, planted them, grew very nicely. But it took a whole year for the goldenrod stowaway to find my Biden's aristosa. But they finally did, and now I've got a good population of both of those. So now we've added 4 species to the property. Hackberry Emperor. Wanted the Hackberry Emperor not because it's the most beautiful butterfly in the world, but because it belongs here. It's one of the species that should be here. And as its name suggests, it's a specialist on hackberry, on Celtis. We didn't have any hackberry. So I planted hackberry. Took 4 years for the butterflies to find my hackberry, but they did. I checked one of my hackberry branches in June, and there were 9 Hackberry Emperor caterpillars on a single branch. So another big success. Now we've added 6 species. And that's how it went. I did not plant goldenrod. It came in on its own. And along with it came many of the things that depend on goldenrod, like the beautiful brown-hooded owlet, the Arcidra flower moth, the goldenrod leaf miner, the distinct Sparaginothus, the goldenrod gall moth. This is one, curiously enough, that has not come, the goldenrod flower moth. I don't know why it hasn't found our goldenrod yet. This is what the caterpillars look like. But this is part of the fun. This is anticipation. This is like waiting for the ketchup to come out of the bottle. Every year I go out and I check my goldenrod looking for this caterpillar. And one of these years I'm going to find it. And that'll be a great year. Planted Virginia creeper. Yes, Virginia creeper. I hear people don't like it. I just don't know why. It's a great native plant. It can climb our trees without girdling them, without pulling them down. It's got good fall color. It makes valuable berries for birds in the fall. They're loaded with fats. That's what the birds need. And what produces those berries is wonderful pollinator flowers in the early part of the summer. They're tiny, inconspicuous. You don't even recognize they're there except for the cloud of bees that's around them. Very attracted to our pollinators. Remember, when you're making a pollinator garden, you're making it for the pollinators. It's not about how pretty it can be for you. It's a good ground cover. But the reason I planted it is that it's the major host plant for the large sphinx moths that are a primary part of cardinal diets. Things like Pandora sphinx, that's what the adult looks like, the lettered sphinx, the hog sphinx, the abbot sphinx, all on Virginia creeper. Want to see if I can get the double-toothed prominent at our house, just because it's such a cool looking caterpillar. I mean, even if you don't like caterpillars, you got to like this guy. Well, it's a specialist on elm, particularly American elm. Of course, we didn't have any American elm. We lost them to the Dutch elm disease, but there are 2 large American elms at the University of Delaware that did not die. They continue to make a lot of seed every year. So when we moved in, I got some seed, planted it. They grew very nicely. Those plants are now 80 feet tall, but they have they brought in the double-tooth prominent right away. Another big success, American elm. Wanted the evening primrose moth because it's beautiful. I like beauty like anybody else. And believe it or not, we had no evening primrose. So I planted evening primrose. Moth came. It spends the day with its head stuffed in the flowers. It's very cute. And I planted lots of oaks. Now, those are just examples of the plant lineages we put back on the property. But I want to focus on oaks because they're such important plants. This is the Bedford oak in Bedford, New York, Martha Stewart land. It's enormous. And people argue about whether it's 400 years old or 500 years old. But I hear people say, I don't want to plant an oak because I won't live long enough to enjoy it. And if you can't enjoy your oak before it's 400 years old, you're right, you won't. But if you can enjoy what your oak is contributing to your yard, to the ecosystem around you, you can enjoy it right away. And I can say that with confidence because I planted most of my oaks as acorns, which means they were free, or as 2-foot bare root whips, which means they cost $1.50 each. And immediately they started to rebuild that caterpillar-based food web by attracting things like the solitary oak leaf miner, Juvenile's dusky wing, the yellow-shouldered moth, Suzuki's promolactus, the red wash caterpillar, the yellow vested moth, the orange tufted oneida, the spiny oak caterpillar, the 2-spotted oak punky, the variable oak leaf caterpillar, the red humped oakworm, the orange humped oakworm, the pink striped oakworm, the hesitant dagger moth, the lesser oak dagger moth, the greater oak dagger moth, the streaked dagger moth, the afflicted dagger moth, the crown bucolatrix, the orange patched smoky wing, the white blotched heterocampa, the oblique heterocampa, the red line panapoda, the laugher, and literally hundreds more moth Hundreds more moth species have come to the oaks on our property, and they come right away. This is a pin oak that has just popped its head above the leaves, and here's a caterpillar standing on the ground eating the leaves of that oak tree. You don't have to wait hundreds of years for your oak to start to contribute in meaningful ways to the life around you. This is what our yard looks like now, taken from the same place I took that original picture. Well, actually, the leaves are down right now, but that's what it looked like this summer. So we put a lot of plants back, and that is how you rebuild an ecosystem. I noticed right away that as you added plants, of course, the moth species that support the food web started to come. So 4 years ago, I made it a goal to start to take a picture of every species of moth that is making a living at our house. I am still at it, but I'm up to 1,140 species of moths that I photographed at our house. That's just moths. We haven't gotten to the butterflies yet. Well, we have 10 acres. Pennsylvania is 2.4 million acres. So on 1/240,000th of the landmass of the entire state, we have 44% of the moths that occur in the entire state. And we have them because we put the plants back. And because so many of those species are types of bird food, we have recorded 60 species of birds that have bred on our 10 acres. Not flew by, but bred, made more birds, made more life. Why am I telling you this? Well, this is another headline that we saw last year. The World Wildlife Fund says that we have lost 2/3 of the wildlife from planet Earth since 1970. But I'm thinking, not at our house. I'm sure we have increased biodiversity by at least 2/3, probably more than that. And it didn't take that long, and it wasn't that hard. We just put the plants back. So when you see headlines like this, they are highly disturbing, but don't give up, please. You can influence the plants around you much more than you think and rebuild the biodiversity that depends on them. But I know what you're thinking. We've got 10 acres and a lot of people don't have that much land. Will it work on smaller plots in suburbia? That is a good question. Let's go to Margie and Dan Terpstra's house in Kirkwood, Missouri, where they have 0.6 acres, 18 times less land than Cindy and I have. They're in the middle of suburbia. All their neighbors have the big lawns. And when they moved in, their yard was choked with bush honeysuckle, Amur honeysuckle. So the first thing they did was take that out. Then they planted 75 species of native plants and added a water feature called they call a bubbler to their yard. Then they sat back and started to count the birds that are using their yard. And they're up to 149 bird species that have used their yard, including 35 warbler species. If any of you are birders, you know that that is a good number of warblers. Just to compare it to the warblers we've seen at our house, we've only recorded 8 warbler species at our house, all on 0.6 acres. So yes, it works on smaller plots. What about urban yards? Let's go to Pam Carlson's house in Chicago. And I mean, in Chicago, that little tower back there, actually it's a big tower. That's O'Hare Airport. Over here is Kennedy Expressway. Pam has 1/10 of an acre, not connected to any natural area at all. And it's 3 times smaller than the average lot size in North America. It's a pretty 1/10 of an acre, but it is an isolated little habitat patch in the middle of a city. She did the same thing. She got rid of her invasive plants, put in 60 species of native plants, added a water feature for the birds, and then she sat back and started to count the birds that are using her yard. And she's up to 120 species, including a woodcock. There's Pam's woodcock. So if you haven't seen a woodcock lately, go to Pam's house in Chicago. There it is. All right, there are 4 things that we need to think about, that we need to get serious about if we're really going to be successful in a big way. And we've got to be successful in a big way. And one of them is we have to shrink the area that we have in lawn. We've got at least 40 million acres of lawn in this country. And that's a 2005 statistic. So we know it's more than that. That's an area the size of New England dedicated to an ecological deadscape. Now, I know we need lawn to advertise our high status, and we need lawn to display our Halloween decorations. But what if we cut that area in half? What if we replanted half the area that is in lawn? So what if we took areas like this and we turned into areas like this? This is a Dan Getman's yard. He sent me this the other day from Missouri. And he's well on his way. Look, reducing the lawn a lot. So what if we did that? That would give us 20 million acres that we could convert to natural areas. And if we did it at home, we could create a new national park that I'm calling Homegrown National Park. And it'll be bigger than the Adirondacks, plus Yellowstone, plus Yosemite, Grand Tetons, Canyonlands, Mount Rainier, North Cascades, Badlands National Park, Olympic National Park, Sequoia National Park, plus the Grand Canyon, plus Denali, which is huge, plus the Great Smoky Mountains. Add up all those parks, still less than 20 million acres. So we'll have Homegrown National Park be the biggest park in the country. What do we get when we put a park at home or some part of nature? We get the opportunity to develop a personal relationship with Mother Nature. At our own pace, at our own time, all we have to do is go outside. We can avoid crowds. You know, if you go to a real national park these days, there were 375 million people that went to national parks last year. So you know what you see when you go to a national park. It's also free. There's no admission fee. It's never closed, no matter what pandemic comes down the pike. No travel hassles. You get to experience the natural world alone, which I think is necessary if you're going to develop that personal relationship with the natural world. It won't be mediated by somebody else. And this is particularly important for our kids who are suffering from nature deficit disorder, according to Richard Louv. So we're trying, we get 30 kids, we put them on a bus with a teacher and they drive for an hour. Then they go to a natural area and walk around for an hour. Teacher tells them not to touch anything. Then they get back in the bus and they go home. And that's their experience with the natural world. Which I'm sure is better than nothing, but it's really been an experience with 30 other kids and a teacher telling them not to touch anything. If they have some part of nature right where they live, all they have to do is go outside alone, no parental supervision, let them interact and learn about nature by themselves, develop that personal relationship. They will come home, I guarantee it. It's so important because our kids are the future stewards of the planet. If they don't know what nature is, if they're afraid of it, if they don't know how to steward it, if they don't know why they need to steward it, if they don't want to steward it, they're going to be lousy stewards. And we can't afford any more lousy stewardship. And maybe they will learn how to hunt lizards. I'm learning this from my own granddaughter, Zoe, who lives in Hawaii in a very modest patch of nature. It's a little piece of grass with a hedge. But there are anole lizards there. And when she discovered that, she sent me this picture describing how you hunt lizards. You get on the ground and you cover yourself with leaves and sticks so the lizards can't see you coming. Then you crawl very slowly toward the lizard. No smiling. This is serious business. You can wear your best dress. That's okay. But you sneak up on the lizard. You catch the lizard. You put the lizard in an aquarium. You learn how to take care of it. You develop a personal relationship with that lizard. Now, I don't think Zoe's going to be catching lizards the rest of her life in her best dress, crawling on the ground. I don't think. She sent me this picture the other day, so who knows? But I guarantee she's going to remember catching lizards in Hawaii the rest of her life. And I also guarantee she's going to be a good steward of the planet because of it. If you want your kids to do more than catch lizards, get Nancy Stranisti's Nature Play at Home. Dozens of examples of how to expose your kids to the natural world right in their yards. And if you want to join Homegrown National Park, you can do that. It is free. You go to our website, homegrownnationalpark.org, and go through the process of getting your property on the map. So what you do is put down your location, the amount of area that you're converting to native plants, that you have converted, that you're protecting, and your little piece of your county will light up with a little lightning bug. And you get to see who else is doing this in your county. This is our attempt at using social media to get the notion that we all have a responsibility toward conservation and that we all can make a big difference towards conservation, because most people don't know that. We want that notion to go viral. So please help us get that 20 million acres of lawn converted. We have over 11,000 people on the map so far, and it hasn't been up all that long. So we're off to a good start, but we need a lot more than that. Okay, we're going to shrink the lawn. What plants should we put in the areas that we're going to remove the lawn from? Some of them, I'm going to argue, have to be what I'm calling keystone plants. Remember the Roman arch, there's the Roman arch. The keystone is the stone in the middle of the arch. And if you take that stone out of the arch falls down. Well, if you take keystone plants out of your local food web, the food web collapses because keystone plants are making most of the food. Just 5% of our native plants are making 75% of the caterpillar food that drives those food webs. 14% of our native plants are making 90% of the caterpillar food that drives those food webs. So think of the keystone plants in the ecological house that you're building as the 2x4s that are holding up that house. They're essential. You're not going to hold up your house with wallpaper. And that's what we've been trying to do for the last 100 years. They're not the only thing you're going to put in your house. So you're not through adding plants when you put in your Keystone plants, but they are essential. So the question no longer is simply, are natives better than non-natives ecologically? On average, they certainly are, but there's a lot of natives that don't do all that much. And I can build an entire native landscape that is extremely unproductive. So the question really is, do we want the very best native plants, the most productive ones, the keystone plants that are going to support the most pollinators and the most caterpillars, or not? I've gotten emails in the past from, I don't know if it's the same person or different people, saying, don't you know that ginkgo biloba from Asia actually grew in North America 7 million years ago? That makes them native. That means we can plant them and everything will be great. Yes, I do know that ginkgos grew in North America 7 million years ago. We can argue about whether that makes them native today, but I'm not going to have that argument because that's not the metric anymore. The metric is productivity. What are they doing? I don't care if ginkgos grew in the moon 7 million years ago. Today, they are producing 0 species of caterpillars. They're occupying space, but not contributing to the local food web. How much more can we afford to do that? What's contributing more than anything else? It's one of our oaks, the genus Quercus. In the mid-Atlantic states, 557 species of caterpillars are supported by oaks, over 950 species nationwide. There's no other plant genus that comes close to that. So just to put this in perspective, tulip trees, wonderful, wonderful plants, they only support 21 species. So the huge differences between keystone oaks and most other plants. If you want to know what the keystone plants are where you live, go to the National Wildlife Federation website. Now we've got 2 options here. One's called Native Plant Finder, but we're converting that to a new one called Keystone Plants by Ecoregion. So there's ecoregion number 1, and that's the way the website is designed right now. It's way too general. It's way too general. We want to move it to ecoregion number 2 so that you can more specifically get a list of plants that are the best for your ecoregion. We're not quite there yet, but we're getting there. Oops. So this is what it's going to look like. You get a list of the plants that are in your ecoregion, and it will be very similar to this. The top one's going to be oaks, and then cherries and willows. They're all going to be up there. Notice I say native oaks, native cherries, native willows, native birches. If I go to the nursery and say I want to buy a cherry and don't specify which one, they're going to sell me an Asian cherry, Asian flowering cherry. If I say I want to buy a willow, they'll sell me a weeping willow from Turkey. If I want to buy a birch, chances are really good it'll be from Europe. So you've got to specify that you want a native member of these important genera, because if you don't get a native member, you're going to reduce caterpillar use by 68%. We have done that experiment. These are the top herbaceous plant genera in your area. In most areas, goldenrod is always way up there. Sunflower is always way up there. The various genera that asters were broken up into high on the list, not just in terms of making caterpillars, but also in terms of supporting these specialist bees. Those 3 genera support more specialist bees than other genera, at least 44 species if you put them all together. Will be in your yard if you have those plants. They won't be in your yard if you don't. Why do we care about specialist bees? Because the generalist bees can use those plants as well. If you plant only for generalists, you've lost the specialists. So we want to focus on specialists when we're making pollinator gardens. All right, we're going to shrink the lawn. We're going to put in keystone plants. We're going to attract a lot of insects to our yard, and then we're going to kill them with our security light, which is not the goal. There's a lot of research coming out these days that is pretty convincing that light pollution at night, all those lights we turn on every single night, is one of the major causes of insect declines, at least in the temperate zone. And these are all the ways that lights kill insects at night. This is actually good news to me. It's good news to me because we must turn around insect declines. We can't tolerate it anymore. We've already lost 45% of the insects that are out there, and that, they're the things keeping us alive. So not acceptable. If we can help that situation by simply flicking a switch, that's good news. We're getting off easy. But I know what you're going to say. I can't turn the light off over my garage, or I can't turn my front porch light off because the bad man will come. All right, put a motion sensor on it so it only turns on when the bad man does come. And the first thing you're going to recognize is the bad man doesn't come very often. And even easier, take the white bulb out of those lights and put in yellow bulbs. Yellow LED bulbs are the best because yellow wavelengths are far less attractive to nocturnal insects than our white wavelengths. If we switched out our white lights with yellow lights overnight, we would save millions of insects and also millions of dollars if we use LEDs because they're far more energy efficient. All right, we're going to shrink the lawn. We're going to use Keystone Plants. We're going to turn out our lights and we're going to invite Mosquito Joe to come kill all of our insects. We have no shortage of ways that we like to kill our insects. This is a booming business all around the country. Mosquito Joe is undoing everything I've been talking about for the last 15 years. But he says it's okay because this is a natural product. And it is. It's a natural product. It's pyrethroids. It's what's found in chrysanthemums. And he also says, but cyanide is a national product too. So I'm not sure that's a good argument. He also says that this only kills mosquitoes. And boy, I wish he was right. But it kills all the insects it comes in contact with. I don't know if you saw the headlines, not this year, but last year, there were big monarch kills when they flew through Mosquito Joe's activities. Hundreds of monarchs dead on the ground. The big thing is it doesn't work. You don't control mosquitoes in the adult stage. You control them in the larval stage. It's too hard to control them in the adult stage. You have to kill 90% of them to get good control. Mosquito Joe kills between 10% and 50% on a good day, which means he has to keep coming back and back and back and keep charging you, and killing lots of non-targets. If you really want to control mosquitoes, get a bucket. And people say, how big a bucket? I don't care. The bigger, the better. Get a bucket, fill it full of water, put in a handful of straw or hay, and let it ferment for a couple of days. And this is in the warm time of the year, of course. And what's going to happen is the populations of diatoms and algae will build up in your bucket. And that becomes irresistible to ovipositing mosquitoes, the female mosquitoes that want to lay their eggs. They will lay their eggs in your bucket. Then you go to the hardware store and you get a mosquito dunk. You put the mosquito dunk, which is Bacillus thuringiensis. It's a natural bacterium that kills aquatic diptera. And the only aquatic diptera in your bucket is mosquito larva. So you put it in there and the mosquito larvae chew on it and they die. So if you get a dragonfly in there, it doesn't hurt it at all. If a bird drinks it or your dog licks it, it doesn't hurt them at all. You might put a coarse screen on the top because if chipmunks jump in there, they drown. But if everybody did this, this would reduce mosquito populations a lot, much better than Mosquito Joe does, much cheaper, and it wouldn't kill anything else. Fourth thing we need to do is to design landscapes that allow caterpillars to complete their development. What do I mean by that? Well, this is just an example. I live in Chester County, Pennsylvania, where oaks support 511 species of caterpillars. A few of them, like the polyphemus moth, complete their development on the tree. They eat the leaves of the tree, then they spin a cocoon and hang from one of the branches, then they emerge as an adult, and then they do it all again. And I wish everything did that, but most species don't. 480 of them, 94% of them finish growing on the tree and then they drop from the tree and they wiggle their way underneath the ground and pupate, or they spin a cocoon in the leaf litter that's under the tree. And that's the problem. There is no leaf litter under the tree. And the ground is mowed and compacted so that it's rock hard and the caterpillars can't get underground. So the way we landscape in so many places becomes an ecological trap. If there are any moths around, they fly in, they lay their eggs on the trees, the caterpillars develop and drop down and die. And of course, the cement landscape is even less of a viable option. I am convinced that the way we landscape under our trees is another major cause of insect declines, but it's another one that's easily reversed. This is what most people do. You got a tree in a yard and then you got the grass. We're just starting to measure how well caterpillars do in a situation like this, but I guarantee they're going to do better in a situation like this, where you have a tree and then a layered landscape, maybe a dogwood here, an azalea, ferns, ground covers. This is a safe site. The caterpillar can drop down. The soil is not compacted. Nobody's going to step on it. Nobody's going to mow it. There's plenty of leaf litter in here. They can spin their cocoon in. So the survivorship will be much higher in a situation like this. This is where you can do your fancy spring ephemeral gardening. We're not talking about reducing gardening here. We're talking about increasing it. This is how you shrink the lawn. You put in beds where there used to be lawn. Your trees will love it, believe me, and it creates safe sites. This is where you liberally use ground covers like wild ginger, like foam flower, like May apples, like ferns. This is a hotel in Athens, Georgia. Those are red maples. Any caterpillars developing on those red maples will drop down into that fern bank and be able to complete their development successfully, even though this is the middle of a city. You know, in other hotels, this is all cement. It doesn't have to be. It doesn't have to be. So we can be a lot more conscious of the needs of our caterpillars underneath our trees almost everywhere. Another grad student, Desiree Narango, did some wonderful work with Carolina chickadees in the suburbs of Washington, D.C. And the results of her study suggest there actually is room for compromise in our plant choice. She asked a simple question: how well do landscapes, suburban yards that are landscaped primarily with native plants, support chickadee populations over time compared to landscapes that are landscaped primarily with Asian ornamentals, the way we typically do? And when they're landscaped primarily with Asian ornamentals, they were 75% fewer caterpillars on those landscapes. So right away, you've reduced the amount of bird food by 75%. Those landscapes were 60% less likely to have breeding chickadees at all. There's nest boxes up in each landscape, but the birds would come and look around and say, there's not enough food here. We're not even going to try to breed. If they did try to breed, they laid 1.5 fewer eggs. Those clutches were 29% less likely to survive at all. If they did survive, they produced 1.2 fewer fledglings, and it took them 1.5 days longer to do that. And if you put all that information into a population growth model as a function of the percentage of non-native woody plant biomass in your yard, from none to 100%. And the reason we focus on woody plant biomass is because that's where chickadees forage. They forage on woody plants. This is what you get. The dotted line here is replacement rate. That's the rate at which the population has to make babies in order to replace the adults that die every year. If you reproduce at that rate, that's a sustainable population. It's not growing, but it's not shrinking either. If you make more babies than adults die, you have a growing population. But if you make fewer babies, beneath this dotted line here, you have a shrinking, unsustainable population. And right here, liberally speaking, is where those lines overlap, which means you can have up to 30% of your woody plant biomass in your yard non-native without destroying the local food web. And we can't tolerate invasive plants here. So no burning bush, no calorie pear, no barberry, no porcelain berry, because those things are ecological tumors. They don't stay in our yards. They go out and they pollute all the natural areas around us. But the ginkgo is not invasive. Your forsythia is not invasive. Your camellias are not invasive. Either is your crepe myrtle. So there is room for compromise, and that's good news to me, because if my message was you can't have any non-native plants, nobody would listen. We love our non-native plants. Here's Dan's property again. This is a ginkgo. His wife wanted a ginkgo. She loves ginkgo trees. So there it is. Is it destroying the productivity of this landscape? No, it's just a tiny fraction of the woody plant biomass that's here. So we can tolerate that. It's not the presence of non-native plants that destroys food webs. It's the absence of the native plants that support those food webs. So increase the amount of native plants and we can tolerate these. Can we use native plants in formal designs? Of course we can. This is a design from Lynn O'Shaughnessy. She sent it to me last year. There's nothing more formal than that. This is taken from a drone 400 feet up. It's a large garden, and every plant in that garden is a native plant. Formality is a function of the design, not a function of the plants in the design. Our native plants are used in formal gardens in Europe all the time. And I guess that's okay because they're non-native plants over there. Can we get a pollinator garden into a typical suburban yard like this without offending anybody? Of course we can. Put a little fence around it. It tells your neighbor that this is on purpose. This is part of your design. It's not a patch of weeds you forgot to mow. It's meeting the needs of a number of bees. It's pretty. It's not very big, but if everybody did it, it would certainly help our pollinator situation quite a bit. Remember why we need pollinators. The media will tell you you need them because they pollinate a third of our crops. But I hear people say, well, I don't live next to a farm, so I don't need any pollinators. It's actually a 12th of our crops. May Berenbaum, University of Illinois, has looked at this. She says it's a 12th of our crops. Forget the crop argument. We need pollinators because they pollinate 80% of all plants and 90% of all flowering plants. If we lost our pollinators, we lose 80 to 90% of the plants on the planet. It's not an option. Where do we need pollinators? Everywhere we need plants, which is everywhere. Drew Latham design, much bigger. Imagine the amount of life that is here versus the amount of life that is here. It really seems like a no-brainer. Can municipalities help us live with nature? Of course they can, and more of them are doing it. Minnesota has a cost-sharing program. It's called the Lawn to Legume program, where the state helps homeowners pay for reducing some or all of their lawn, converting it to appropriate Minnesota prairie plants. Very popular. Pennsylvania has a new lawn conversion program, up to $5,000 per acre to convert your lawn to natives. Florida, there's an island off of Florida that's paying residents to allow burrowing owls to burrow in the front yard. This is the way the Endangered Species Act should have been written. The burrowing owl is a listed species. And you know, we're going to pay you to take care of it. It should have been written with carrots rather than sticks. Right now, everybody's afraid if they have an endangered species on the property, they'll get fined if they do anything. If everybody got paid for it, everybody would want one and be good stewards of them. St. Louis, Missouri, Fayetteville, Arkansas have a bounty on calorie repairs. You take out the calorie repair, you get a free tree replacement, and even water utilities. Public utilities are getting in the act. In San Antonio, they give you a $100 coupon to buy native plants that are water efficient to reduce the amount of water that is being used. And of course, the big lawn conversion programs in California, up to $2 per square foot rebate for removing lawn and replacing it with xeric plantings. California does not have one drop of water for lawns. I think we made 3 missteps in the early years of conservation. And the first one's a serious one. We've come to think of nature as optional. I don't know how we got there, but we think it's optional. We like it. We like to visit it, but we don't think it's essential. And that means when push comes to shove, when resources are in short supply, nature takes a back seat. And that's always. Resources are always in short supply. I went to the Cincinnati Zoo before the virus broke out, and there's this wall-sized poster there that to me epitomizes our society's view of conservation. We're going to save wildlife so that future generations can enjoy it. That's the message here. That was Teddy Roosevelt's message. We're going to create national parks because these are wonderful places, and we want future generations to be able to enjoy them. But again, that suggests nature's there just for entertainment. No wonder we don't think it's essential. We need nature so that we have future generations. It's a little bit more urgent. We've also assumed that humans and nature cannot coexist. We talked about this, but if we restrict conservation just to areas where there's not a lot of humans, we're going to fail because those areas are too small, they're too few, they're too isolated from each other. David Quammen has an excellent analogy between a Persian rug and an ecosystem. That's a Persian rug. That's not 71 Persian rugs. That's 71 rug fragments, none of which are acting like a Persian rug. And that's what we've done to our ecosystems. The UN designates biosphere reserves as places of ecological significance. And I hate that language because it suggests they're places on planet Earth with no ecological significance. Not so. Every square inch of the planet has ecological significance, including our yards, including our roadsides, including our corporate landscapes, even including much of our agriculture. So we need to put the plants back, folks. We need to fill in these gaps, not just to make biological corridors that allow plants and animals to move back and forth between viable habitats, but to create viable habitats where we've destroyed them, where we live, work, farm, and play. When we do this, it's going to be the first time in modern history that we have coexisted with nature rather than expelled nature to some other place. Our third misstep was to leave Earth stewardship to just a few specialists, a few conservation biologists, a few ecologists. For some reason, we did not see it. It's not part of our culture to see it as an inherent responsibility of every human being on the planet. But I don't know why, because every human being on the planet depends entirely on the quality of Earth's ecosystem. So why wouldn't everybody bear the responsibility of taking care of those ecosystems? Stan Resworth, a Cherokee elder, once said that the Western settler mindset was, I have rights. The mindset of indigenous people is, I have obligations. You were not born with those mindsets, you're taught them. We're very good at teaching this one. We've been terrible at teaching this one. Teaching our kids, teaching our peers that we all have obligations to good Earth stewardship. It doesn't mean you have to save biodiversity for a living, but you can save it where you live. And if you do, it empowers you. You know, right now, so many people feel powerless. The Earth's problems are huge. What can one person do? Well, one person can shrink their lawn. One person can get rid of their invasive species on their property. We didn't even talk about that. One person can put in a pollinator garden. One person can use keystone species. One person can put in a pollinator. Did I just say that? One person can do all those things and revitalize the turn out their lights. One person can turn out their lights. They can revitalize their little local ecosystem, enhance the ecosystem in which their yard actually occurs. And it also shrinks the problem down to something that's manageable for each one of us. Don't think about the entire planet's problems. You'll get depressed. Just worry about the piece of the earth that you can influence. If you own property, that's a no-brainer. You start there. That's your responsibility. If you don't own property, help somebody who does. Help a park or a preserve. Help a land conservancy. They're all underfunded. They're all understaffed. As a volunteer, they will love you. So as property owners or as volunteers, each one of us has the power, and we certainly have the responsibility to fix dead landscapes like this. Whether or not we decide to do so is going to determine nature's fate and ultimately our own fate. And I think I've convinced my grandchildren that you are nature's best hope. I hope I've convinced you as well. Thanks very much. I'm done.
Thank you very much. So we do have a Q&A session. We've got our moderator here. And if you are online, if you can just fill out the poll that we just put up, it helps us get more accurate attendance. So our Q&A today will be moderated by Dr. Emma Oshrin. Dr. Emma Oshrin is the director of Budburst at the Chicago Botanic Garden. Her background is in plant ecology, and through Budburst, which is a citizen science project focused on observing plant seasonal changes, she gets to work in both research and education and help answer questions about climate change using plants. So please welcome Dr. Emma Oshrin.
Hi, everyone. Hi, Doug. Thanks for your talk. It was great to hear about the work that you're doing and the work that we can all do to help. I have questions that have been collected from folks that have read your book and that I'm sure are in attendance tonight. So I will just read through them and hopefully we can get some discussion going from the questions.
Okay.
So our first one comes, oh, go ahead.
You're young to have a PhD, Emma. You can't.
It's relatively recent, but I do have one.
Right.
Our first question comes from Reed, and they say, Elmhurst has a parkway tree program run by forestry, and they plant 600 trees a year. Homeowners get to choose from a list, but the default is ginkgo. Ginkgos support 3 species, while another option, oaks, support somewhere above 400, like you explained in your talk.
Actually,
Native
those
plants
3 species are mistaken records. They actually support nothing.
Ah, yes, got an overestimation here on the ginkgos.
Yeah.
Native plants would be better, but it's complicated due to costs, maintenance, tree survival issues, etc. Do you have any tips for how to productively approach the local government about changing these practices?
People are successfully doing that. So you approach them gently. You suggest that we've learned a lot about the importance of different tree species. They're not all the same. They're not there just as decorations. They have important ecological roles. You can point out the downside of using ginkgos. Yes, there's positive sides. They do well in high pollution and other things like that. But it doesn't mean there are no native plants that can't tolerate those conditions either. We need to spend a lot more effort finding the ones that are very good at very tough city situations. We've always relied immediately on plants from China. For some reason, we think only plants from China can survive in cities, and of course that's ridiculous. One of the arguments against oaks is that they're going to lift up hardscape and they get too big. But we have small species of oaks, so we need to start thinking about those things like Quercus prinoides, dwarf chinkapin or dwarf chestnut oak. So all oaks are not gigantic, and all oaks do not lift up hard space. We just need to put a little effort into finding out which ones are better. And I see it a lot around that we are doing better in that regard.
Great, that's good advice. Thanks. Okay, our next question comes from Lee, and they say the National Park Service is updating the species of trees to be planted to those that will thrive under the environmental changes caused by climate change. Are there lists of native plants to consider for each zone based on the changes we are expecting, such as flooding, humidity, invasive species?
Well, this is a debatable area right now. A lot of people are suggesting we use species from farther south because it's going to get warmer. But look what happens. Well, climate change really means increased climate variability. We still have cold snaps. We still have polar vortices. Look what happened in Texas last February. We had a deep freeze all the way down into Mexico. Any of the southern plants that we moved forward would have died, and did die. They lost an awful lot of plants that have been inching their way forward. So my recommendation would be to focus on the plants that are good where you are right now and increase the genetic variability to the point where they can adapt to these stresses. That's the best I can suggest at this point. We don't know what plants are going to be best 100 years from now. So pretending that we know exactly which ones just because the Earth's going to be warmer, I think is misleading.
Mm-hmm. All right. And another person asks, Karen asks, can you tell us more about the caterpillars overwintering on oak trees?
There are very few that overwinter on the trees that Polyphemus moth does. Most of them have fallen from the tree and they're underneath the tree. So they're well, okay. The white oak group has a condition called marcescence, where many of the leaves stay on the tree through the winter. So any caterpillar that has folded over the edge of the leaf and formed a little cocoon in it will also stay on the tree during the winter and not fall off until April or so. So those species remain on the tree. But again, most of them do fall off and are pupating under the tree in leaf litter, or they actually burrow down under the ground. Is that what you were looking for with that? I'm not sure.
I think so. I think this person is asking for a little more information about it. So that's great. And then Kelly shares with us, your writing helped me find real purpose in my love of gardening, and I'm so grateful. It also made me aware that my Dynatrap is probably killing too many beneficial bugs. Can you go into more detail on how to control mosquitoes in suburban yards without harming other bugs? Which I guess you did in the talk. I don't know if you have any more to add.
Well, the other thing that people use are bug zappers. Is that what a Dynatrap is, a bug zapper? We did a study in 1996 with traditional bug zappers to see what percentage of the kills that are occurring. I mean, insects fly into those traps and get zapped, and people hear the zaps and they get all excited. I'm killing mosquitoes. It was 0.02% of the kill was actually biting flies. So almost everything was a non-target. Now they have worked to improve the traps since then. They've added octanol and cow breath and CO2 and temperature, and that does attract more mosquitoes, but there's still a large non-target catch. There are things like midges, chironomids. They look just like mosquitoes. Everybody sees a pile of chironomids there and they think they've killed all mosquitoes. Chironomids don't even have mouth parts. So it can be misleading, but the best way I know is to look at the sources of mosquito breeding in your area. So if you have, the tires and the flower pots full of water and your gutters plugged up, mosquitoes are going to breed in those sites. An area that people ignore, though, if you live in a suburb with sewers, those sewers almost never drain. There's usually an inch or two of water in the bottom of those sewers, and a lot of mosquitoes are breeding down there. You might throw a dunk or two down there. It's something people just ignore. And of course, if you live next to a marsh or something, there's not much you can do about that. But I would love to see a wide scale use of mosquito dunks in the yards with these little buckets and see how well it works. In theory, it should work well. It works at my house, but I'm one data point. So.
All right, we got to collect more data then.
Yeah.
Okay, so Barbara asks, are our efforts pointless if our neighbors are using lawn pesticides? And what impact does municipal mosquito spraying have on the ecosystems we're trying to save?
It's terrible. I mean, that stuff is floating everywhere, undoing everything you just did. I have a retired professor from our department he's got natives all over his yard, and he works hard to have monarchs. And he approached me last summer and said, I've got milkweeds everywhere and no monarchs at all. I said, is your neighbor fogging for mosquitoes? And he said, yeah. So, that's what's happening. So it can be an interesting legal question. Does your neighbor have the right to kill the life on your yard? Nobody's done that, but we don't think about what we do on our properties and how it might affect other properties. And almost everything we do on our property does affect somebody else. If you had a stream going through your yard, you would understand that you don't throw cyanide in that stream because it doesn't stay in your yard. It goes downstream and it affects everything downstream. So does most of the things you do in your yard, including your plant choice, whether or not you're using pesticides on your lawn, whether or not you're spraying for mosquitoes. And it's not just spraying for mosquitoes. The lawn service people are spraying your plants all the time. It's just part of the deal. You're paying for it, so they come and do it whether you need it or not. We've got this love affair with insecticides, and it's one of the reasons we got insect decline. It's the misuse and overuse of pesticides. It's not that they're never appropriate, but spraying when there's nothing there is inappropriate. So yes, we can do a whole lot better. How do you deal with your neighbor? That's a classic sociological problem. Be on good terms with them and maybe explain, there are issues with this. And if that doesn't work, I don't know what you do.
All right. We've got a question from Nicola, who explains, our local electricity provider trimmed one of my bur oak trees, and consequently, that tree died a slow death within 1 year. I had 3 different arborists examine the tree and tell me it was dying, though they did not know why. Is it possible the utility company's contractor is not cleaning their saws and spreading a contagion or otherwise harming trees?
Well, do you know if it died of oak wilt or one of the big diseases we've got around here? Did they?
I don't. If Nicola is here, please leave something in the chat. We can look at it that way.
So that's what I suspect. It depends on how heavily they prune it too. You can kill a tree by pruning too much at one time and in an inappropriate place and in an inappropriate time. You never want to prune an oak during the growing part of the season, because that is when you get infected by diseases the easiest. So if the electric company could do their pruning during dormancy, that will help a lot. But they do it here too. They just come along, and if your tree is growing up into wires, they're going to cut it back. It's another reason for using smaller oaks in areas that would need to be trimmed, so they never actually reach the wires. We need to get some of these smaller oaks into the trade. There are oaks that are actually ground covers or small shrubs. Many more of them in the West than in the East, but they are available, and we need to make an effort to get them into the trade for exactly this reason.
Yeah. Nicola did respond in the chat and said that the 3 arborists could not determine the cause, but the plant was pruned in the winter. If that.
Okay, well, they did that right then. Sometimes they just remove too much material, and maybe the tree was stressed anyway for another reason. Hard to say.
Okay. We've got a question from Liz, who asks, in the past, I've sprayed my trees, including a large oak, due to a winter moth infestation that defoliated the tree. Should I stop this annual treatment?
Yes.
Okay.
Absolutely. Winter moth is an invasive species. It was introduced, but it's a geometrid that is actually very tasty for our birds. So gypsy moth is not tasty. It's a hairy caterpillar and the birds don't eat it. But winter moth is, it's something the birds love. Of course, we've lost a lot of birds, but the winter moth is out there right when the migrants are coming through. And if you have a good bird migration, they will eat your winter moths and keep them in check. This is a judgment call. If you have a huge outbreak and it defoliates your tree, and it looks like that's going to happen 2 or 3 years in a row, then yes, you want to control it. But it's much better to get the natural enemies to build up so that it stays at a lower level. It means you'll have some, but right now you're probably spraying your tree for no reason. The winter moth goes like this. You're going to spray your tree and kill all the other things on your oaks when you actually have no winter moths. So spraying by the calendar is never a good idea. It's sometimes it's appropriate, but do your best to never do it.
Okay. And then
one more thing about winter moths is they're having a lot of success with biocontrol. The guy working on biocontrol near the Boston area says he can't even find populations anymore to study because his parasitoids have controlled them so well. So that's the way to go.
That's great. The next question asks, how much growth have you seen in Homegrown National Park since Nature's Best Hope was published?
Well, Homegrown National Park, the website started after Nature's Best Hope was published. So all the growth we've seen in it has occurred since that book came out. It's doing pretty well. As I said, we've gotten over 11,000 people on it. But the we is really Michelle Alfanderi, who created the site and does almost all the work in it, and it's voluntary. Now we had to pay for the coding to create the map and everything. That's expensive. I talk about it, but I don't do. I'm just not a social media guy. So everybody says get somebody in your team to do this. Our team is pretty small. So given that, I think we've done pretty well. I literally have reached tens of thousands of people. I realize that, but I need to reach tens of millions of people to do what we want to do with this map. And that's what we're looking for, this viral where people are promoting it themselves. We all get, it's a call to action where we're all going to save biodiversity together and people feel like they're part of a group. That's what's going to get this rolling, we hope.
That was going to be one of my questions, was what can people do to help you reach more people with the message? Is it shared to our networks?
Talk to that neighbor who's spraying their lawn or something. Hey, look, here's an alternative. You can be part of the solution here. Mm-hmm. We need to change the cultural norm where having a dead landscape is not high status anymore. That's going to be the social pariah. So when you have no birds in your yard, you're doing something wrong. We're going to help you fix this. Right now, people think that's the way it's got to be, just because that's the way it's always been. They don't realize there's no nature out there. Give them a copy of the book and see if it convinces them. But that's how we want to get people. I've already convinced the choir that this is what they should do. They already knew what they should do. We got to get to the non-choir. And that's why I do these talks and so on and so forth. But you all can help. You really can help.
We have a few more on here. I think we've got about 5 more minutes, so I will move through a few more. We have a question asking, short of planting an oak tree, what is the best thing we can do in our yards to restore ecosystems?
There are 4 things every yard has to accomplish. One is sequester carbon. So you want the plants that are going to do that. It's not just oaks that do that. Any plant sequesters carbon, including lawn. But lawn is the worst choice. It's got tiny little roots. You mow it all the time. And after 50 years of lawn, you still have no carbon in your soil. So that's not the solution. Anything else is better. Those prairie plants in the Midwest are really good. They've got very deep roots and they put a lot of carbon into the soil, even though they're herbaceous things. So we're going to sequester carbon. We got to manage the watershed. Again, the plants you put in your yard are going to manage the watershed. And again, your lawn is the worst at doing that. We've got to support pollinators. So if you have enough sun to have flowering plants, you want to get them into your yard to support as many pollinators, as many specialist pollinators as possible. And you want to support that food web. That's where the Keystone Plants come in. So your oaks and your cherries and your birches and your hickories and viburnums, all those plants that are very good at supporting the food web. So that's what every property should be doing. You want to look at your property and say, how well am I doing each one of these things? All of us can do it better. So just pick at it. You don't have to do this in 2 weeks. It can be a lifetime hobby to improve it. But those are all the goals that we should have.
Absolutely. Another question asks, if lawn care and landscape companies are supposed to be experts in the field, why do they do so much wrong? For example, leaf blowers, volcano mulch, pesticides, and how can we change the practices of a whole industry?
Well, because the horticultural field has not been the ecological field. They weren't trained to do it that way. They were trained, nobody was trained to do volcano mulching. I don't know where that happened. Everybody complains about it. That's just ignorance. But they could be trained. We have an empty niche that I call ecological landscaping or ecological gardeners. Wherever I go, people say, who can I hire? And most of the time I say, I don't know. There ought to be, all of those industries ought to be trained to do this without even thinking about it. Most people don't garden. Most people just hire somebody. Most people don't even mow their lawn. They hire somebody. I want people to be able to hire people who know which plants to use, how to maintain them. They all have to be maintained. How much lawn should you have? This has got to be common knowledge. It's got to be part of the culture in the future. And that's going to require a lot of people. Nobody's going to lose their job over this because, it's not labor free to put these plants in, and it's not labor free to take care of them. It will be less maintenance once it's established, but we've got to establish a lot of plants out there. So it does require a lot of training, and there are a few people putting out their shingles now saying I'm a good ecological landscaper. That niche has to grow. So I encourage you. It's a great, could be a really good career for somebody looking for something to do.
Absolutely. So we are almost at time for the event technically, and I want to be respectful of everyone's time. So I'm going to pass it back to Jez. Thank you so much for answering all of these questions.
You're welcome.
Great. Thank you very much. Appreciate hearing all of those great answers. Now, Emma, you are local and you work at the Chicago Botanic Garden. Can you tell us a little bit about your Bud Burst project?
Yes, absolutely. So I lead a project called Bud Burst. We are a citizen science project at the Chicago Botanic Garden. And if anything in this talk was of interest to you and you want another way to help contribute to solving these big problems and working on issues of climate change and how to protect our nature in our own backyards, Bud Burst could be a really fantastic way for you to do that. One of the things that we do is we collect research, we collect data on plants in our yards, in our neighborhoods, out on hikes. So if you are a gardener or you're interested in plants and pollinators, you can collect data with Bud Burst and help us answer these big questions about how plants are being impacted by climate change. So you can make observations on any plant from any location. And recently we also added making pollinator observations as well. So if the pollinator side of this is really interesting to you, you can participate in Bud Burst by collecting data with us on the plants and the pollinators in your yard. And it helps us with real scientific projects. And you can do it just from your phone. It's very easy. And if you want more information about it, you can go to budburst.org. I will put a link in the chat so people can see that. And thank you so much for having me here.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you so much. To Doug Tallamy and Emma, we really appreciate both of you being here tonight virtually. And I hope everyone was inspired by this. It was certainly inspirational to me. If you haven't read the book, you can get a copy here. We appreciate you coming out tonight. So thank you, everyone. And thank you to Jez for organizing the program.
Okay, good night, everybody.